House from 1986 is a horror movie about an author named Roger Cobb who inherits a house from his aunt that turns out to be haunted. Roger is working on a book about his experiences in Vietnam, and he starts noticing weird supernatural things going on in the house. We also find out as the movie goes on that his son actually disappeared while in the pool at this house.
I liked how Roger attributes all of the weird stuff happening to his PTSD, and he's already taking medication for it. One of my favorite parts about this movie was how it does a nice job of explaining things in a seamless way without breaking the flow of the story, and even manages to do it well without any dialogue, because a lot of the time Roger is alone, so talking out loud to nobody wouldn't make any sense anyway.
And I like how a lot of the information that we get about the backstory is in flashbacks that don't feel boring or like you just want them to get out of the way to get back to the main story.
I even like how the opening of the whole movie launches us right into the story very smoothly with no more than 10 words of dialogue. The explanations for the who, what, when, where, and why are organically inserted as the movie goes forward.
I would say the same thing is true about the way the movie integrates the comedy, because there's a lot of humor in this movie. It's never laugh out loud goofy, but there's always kind of a juxtaposition of the horror elements and the humor in the situations. And it does a good job of introducing that in a way that feels like it doesn't just come out of nowhere.
I agree, but I did feel in the last quarter of the movie, the seriousness and the humor kind of started to butt heads, and it veered from one to the other kind of haphazardly. And I think of when he had to babysit the kid, which is the only scene in the movie that really stood out to me as not belonging.
Yeah, I agree.
Where you going, little fella? Stay here. I'll get him.
And the entire ending arc when he finds his son.
As far as the tone goes, I agree, but I did like the way the movie tied things up as far as his Vietnam connection goes.
Oh yeah, for sure. I really liked how all of Roger's traumas ended up being connected. It helped bring the whole movie together. And I also like how the house, in addition to just being a haunted house, used Roger's past and fears against him. And it made his character actually part of the movie, not just a random guy who happens to be tortured in this haunted house, which can be good. And I think of The Evil Dead, but I felt like Roger's past being connected to the plot set this movie apart and added more depth. Originally, this was written as a straight horror movie.
The original story idea was by Fred Dekker, who would go on to write and direct Night of the Creeps and The Monster Squad, and the movie was directed by Steve Miner, who directed Friday the 13th Parts 2 and 3.
And I was surprised this one didn't have a lot of blood and gore, considering he had just directed 2 Friday the 13th movies right before this one.
That's a good point. He did say that he was kind of using this movie as a way to potentially get out of the horror genre if he wanted to, by throwing in the comedy stuff and showing that he could do those kind of movies as well. Part of what makes the humor work is the fact that it comes out of the situations as opposed to coming out of outright jokes or goofy performances. The actors mostly play everything straight, and that's what makes it so funny. And I particularly like the real estate agent at the beginning, played by Michael Ensign, who was in Ghostbusters.
$5,000? I had no idea it'd be so much. I won't pay it.
He's an asshole, but it's really funny because he's completely oblivious to it.
Wait, Ray, got it. Oops, sorry about that.
One of the minor parts in this movie is played by Stephen Williams. We've seen him before on this channel in Jason Goes to Hell. Don't watch that video because it's not good. And of course, he was also in X-Files.
As Mr. X. I also noticed Mindy Sterling popped up near the beginning at the book signing, which I'm going to point out, that book signing scene was really funny, just all those weird people.
It gave me PTSD to dealing with the public in a customer service job.
I thought his aunt was really weird, but in a great way. Roger's neighbor is played by George Wendt of Cheers fame, who sets up his character type pretty effectively right away.
Woman lived here before you was nuts. Biggest bitch under the sun. Just a senile old hag, really. Wouldn't be surprised if someone just got fed up and offed her, you know what I mean? She was my aunt. Heart of gold, though.
I especially like the scene where Roger enlists his help in dealing with a monster hiding in the closet. He tells him that it's a raccoon, and I really like how he tries to pretend that he's not afraid. His performance is great in that scene. That monster was made up of a bunch of bodies of people who died in Vietnam, and I wish you got a better look at it in the movie, because it looks really cool in real life.
Now, see, I didn't realize that, and it makes it even cooler because it connects it to Roger's backstory.
Yeah, the idea was that a lot of the manifestations of the house were basically coming out of his mind, and it doesn't come across in the movie as much as I wish it did, but it just shows how much thought they put into this movie.
This house knows everything about you. Leave while you can.
No!
I liked that closet monster. It gave me a Hellraiser vibe. And the monsters in the dead zone inside the mirror were really cool and Evil Dead-esque. And Big Ben was cool too, especially his facial maneuverability. The only monsters that really didn't work for me were the other humanoid ones. They felt more like cheap Halloween costumes and almost like they ran out of budget.
I could see that. I disagree personally. I find them pretty creepy. They look almost like comic book caricatures, and for some reason to me, I don't know, it makes them creepier. And I actually had a nightmare one time about a monster that looked like the witch creature that his ex-wife apparently turns into at one point. So I can attest to the effectiveness of the design, at least in some way.
It seemed like they had a really decent budget for this movie, and it shows in a lot of shots.
I really like the shot at the beginning of the movie that starts out as a crane shot and then tracks around the entire house. It was really impressive.
And some budget-saving things that were really effective, like the medicine cabinet. And all they did was just move the backing out of it.
Yeah, it was a really simple effect, but sometimes those can really work. You mentioned Evil Dead. I wondered if maybe Sam Raimi was influenced by this movie when he made Evil Dead 2, which goes in a much more comedic direction than the first Evil Dead. They're both horror comedies. They both involve a severed hand with a life of its own. I wondered if the witch monster thing inspired the woman in the basement in Evil Dead 2, and they both have a weird flying demon. What did you think about the musical interludes?
Feeling better now that we're through. Feeling better 'cause I'm over you.
There were two of them close together.
Right in the middle of the movie.
Each night before you go to bed, my baby.
And the fact that it was just there made it not fit as well as it could have if they had spread it out or done it more.
I agree. By the time you get them, you're so far into the movie that they feel so out of place. And the song choices themselves gave me the impression that the filmmakers listened to the chorus and didn't actually listen to anything else because they don't really have anything to do with what's going on.
They're good songs, though.
Okay.
The music was very much quintessential 80s horror movie music, and I liked it. It was done by Harry Manfredini,
Who is most closely associated with the Friday the 13th franchise.
which makes sense because Steve Miner directed some of those.
And Sean S. Cunningham was the producer of this movie, and he directed the first Friday the 13th.
This movie is not in a lot of people's lists of 80s horror movies to watch. And I wonder if the humor had something to do with that because it's not a straight horror movie. What do you think?
I think that's a good question. It's definitely not up on the level of something like Evil Dead or Poltergeist or American Werewolf in London for another comedic horror movie. I don't know if I'd go so far as to call it a classic, but I definitely think it's an effective movie that pulls off exactly what it's trying to do.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't call it a classic.
I do think it deserves more attention than it gets nowadays.
Agreed. I think it's worth watching. It's not a bad good movie. It's a legit good 80s horror movie that, like you said, does exactly what it sets out to do.
Roger Cobb is played by William Catt, who is probably best known for the TV show The Greatest American Hero. He was also in Carrie and a bunch of other movies. He really carries the movie on his shoulders and does a good job, carrying the comedic elements when he needs to, but also doing well with the dramatic scenes.
And he had to, because he was alone on screen for most of the movie.
Godzilla fans will be interested to know that before making this movie, Steve Miner, being a big Godzilla fan himself, actually went to Toho and got the rights to make a Godzilla movie, and he hired Fred Dekker to write the script, and William Stout was doing storyboards and pre-production art, but when Miner shopped the movie around to different studios, they all said it would be too expensive, but that led to Miner working with Fred Dekker on House, and William Stout actually painted one of the paintings that Roger Cobb's aunt is supposed to have painted, as well as having done a bit of pre-production work on this movie. There were a couple of sequels to this movie. House 2 came out the following year, directed by Ethan Wiley, who wrote the screenplay for the first movie. That one goes in a much more comedic direction.
But a stupid comedic direction.
I feel like a lot of the jokes were probably funny on paper, but the performances are so over the top that it mostly falls flat.
We heard a noise.
Noise? The really loud crashing noise. Yeah.
I couldn't even get through the second one.
I would say the second one is still worth watching for the effects. Ethan Wiley started out in effects, and he basically called in a lot of friends to help out on that movie. So there's a lot of cool stuff in it. But he also said that he didn't know if he'd ever get a chance to direct again, so he just threw in everything he ever wanted to see into one movie. So it's a bunch of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with anything else. Dinosaurs and ancient Mayan temples and old cowboys. It's weird.
Just when you say it like that, it sounds like it would not be good.
I would say it's not a good movie, but it is enjoyable to a certain extent. I can appreciate what they were going for.
If you like special effects.
And I do like John Ratzenberger in that movie.
Looks like you got some kind of alternate universe in there or something. I've been through this kind of thing before. Don't touch anything till I get there.
So we get another Cheers connection in that sequel.
Uh-huh.
The next sequel was House 4, which brings back William Catt as Roger Cobb, but with a completely different family, so it doesn't tie into the first movie at all. He just has the same name, which doesn't make any sense. I haven't seen that movie since I was a kid, so I can't specifically vouch as to the quality, but I remember it being disappointing, although I do remember being creeped out by the pizza scene.
Were there mushrooms on it?
No.
Don't forget to eat your favorite pizza, man.
Eagle-eared listeners will notice that I skipped over House 3.
Eagle-eared listeners? Are you kidding me?
Yeah. That's because in the United States, there is no House 3. Sean S. Cunningham had made another movie called The Horror Show that was marketed overseas as House 3. So when it came time to actually make another House movie, they said, well, let's avoid confusing people by calling it House 4, which of course resulted in a lot of confusion. So for the most part, you can skip the sequels. The first one is really the only good movie in the series. So if you haven't seen this movie before, and you're a fan of 80s horror movies, we definitely recommend checking it out. Thanks for watching.
And thanks to our patrons for supporting the channel.